everyone, this is Adrian Alex Poe, and this is going to be a three-part video talking about the horror film eras, and we'll be exploring the horror movie genres throughout the decades. And as I was doing research for this, I realized that I noticed like a pattern that was going on with the different trends of horror movies that were becoming real popular, but then slowly fading off and dying. And I also realized that everything happens in cycles. So keep that in mind as we track the different horror movies and evolution of them throughout the decades. So in part one, let's go over the timeline that we're going to discuss. We're going to start real quick in the 1900s with the first horror movie ever made, then move on to the 20s with the silent horror movies, and in the 30s when they invented sound, in the 40s where you had a bunch of monster movies but they were overload and people were getting tired of it. Then in the 50s we will talk about the nuclear mega monster era that I like to coin, and I'll explain why they were called the nuclear monsters. And in the 60s we'll talk about the social revolution having to do with racial tensions in the country and the mood of the country. And then we move on to the 70s, which have to do with exploitation films and a little mix of religious occult. And then we'll go to the 80s, which is my favorite era and favorite genre, which is the slasher films. So I'm real excited for that, for the 80s. And then we're going to finish off in part one with the 90s broken up in two halves. In the early part of the 90s, we'll talk about the early CGI. And then in the middle half to the end of the 90s, we will talk about a renaissance of a certain type of genre that appeared, and the trend began for a short while, but then it died off again. So let's get started. So let's quickly talk about the first horror movie ever made. So in the 1900s, the first depiction of supernatural events appeared in several of the silent shots created by a French film pioneer named Georges Méliès, or Méliès, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, in the late 1890s. He's best known for a movie called Le Manoir du Diable, which translates to House of the Devil, which you could see a screenshot on the upper right. And he also made other horror films, another one called The Cave of the Demons. During this era, once he made the first official horror movie, other movie companies were making horror movies based on literary adaptations of Edgar Allan Poe, which is my favorite writer of all time. And another movie company in 1908 produced Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which I'm sure everyone's heard of, and you can actually see at the bottom the newspaper clipping. Some other movies in 1910 was Frankenstein from the Mary Shelley's Frankenstein from the novel. Another film I came across, I think a Japanese director did this. You could see a screenshot on the right, Resurrection of a Corpse. So, but it all started with Georges Méliès, and he was a French director that he didn't start out making horror movies, he just made regular films. On the bottom you could see some of the shots from his movie Trip to the Moon, which I actually seen that picture of the moon. It was very iconic. I just never knew it was from him, so that was pretty cool to find out. The horror movie era in the 20s were all silent films. So here are a few horror movies that they were making in the 20s. So you had Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is technically a remake from the 1908 movie. So already back then they were doing remakes. You also had Hunchback of Notre Dame, Nosferatu, Phantom of the Opera. And in this era, the genre was basically on supernatural events or ghosts or ghostly encounters in the movies, because he didn't have no sound, so all the silent films. I'm sure you've seen some on TV where, you know, the picture was very grainy. You'd have that like quick flashing, picture, or the video would like have little flashes, and then you'd have the exaggerated action, and then it would cut to a black screen with writing, or just like some type of paper with writing, and it would cut back to the action, and you would have that crazy piano music, or that opera horror music playing. So these are just some of the horror movies from the 20s. Now in the 30s, you had the invention of sound in movies. So in the 30s also marked the first time in the industry that the word horror was used to describe the genre. Previously, it was really just romance melodrama with a dark element. And it also saw the first horror stars being born. Bela Lugosi of Dracula was arguably the first to specialize solely in the genre. And I also threw in there Boris Karloff, who is famous for playing Frankenstein, and also in The Mummy and some other horror movies he played in too. So basically, the horror genre in the 30s is horror or gothic horror. And so now that you had the invention of sound, you could redo all the movies, because from the 20s you had monster movies that spilled over into the 30s, and now you can redo them all with sound. So that's why you had the majority of horror movies being monster movies, but now with sound. So for example, Dracula, Frankenstein, another very creepy movie in the 1932, Freaks, which actually used actual like disabled people from the circus. So it was no special effects back then. You also had The Mummy, The Invisible Man, The Bride of Frankenstein. So everything was just done with sound, and there was new possibilities. So that's why you had like an influx of monster movies now. Now we get to the 40s era, which something very interesting was happening. So because from the 30s you had the invention of sound and all these monster movies were happening, in the 40s it was still all monster movies, because the invention of sound was still relatively new, but they were running out of ideas now. So they were still doing monster movies like The Wolfman, another remake of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but because they were running out of ideas with the monsters, for example, in 1943 you had Frankenstein meets the Wolfman. So now you had collaborations where Dracula met Frankenstein versus the Wolfman versus, whoever else, and it was getting saturated, and it was becoming like a joke really, because by the end 1948 you had Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein. They also meet Dracula. So it was really a running joke now. There were still a few originals like The Body Snatchers and I Walk with a Zombie, but ultimately now the monster genre was dying out. So they needed to come up with something new. So now we go to the era of the 50s, which I like to call the nuclear mega monster era. So you still had monster movies that spilled over from the 40s, but during this time, World War II was over, and the subgenres of horror that emerged were the doomsday films and the demonic films. So low budget productions featured humanity overcoming threats such as alien invasion and deadly mutations to people, plants, and insects. Japan's experience with Hiroshima and Nagasaki spawned films featuring mutation from the effects of nuclear radiation. So during this time, people were like coming off World War II, and they were still, worried about the nuclear blast and nuclear weapons. So that's why you got these monster movies having to do with like mutations, like Godzilla, where it was just a lizard that got hit with a nuclear blast, and it grew and it started attacking the whole city. You had Creature from the Black Lagoon, which was some type of mutation. You had The Thing from Another World, based off the Arthur C. Clarke novel, that later throughout the decades they were doing remakes, and then another remake that we'll eventually talk about. You also had The Blob from Outer Space. It came down and it just started growing and attacking people. You also had The Fly, which was a man and a fly mutated together. Also during this time, people were movie Theaters were trying to make everything lighthearted and, bring people into the theater to see it. So they were coming up with gimmicks like the first 3D movie was House of Wax, starring Vincent Price, which he went on to star in other horror movies throughout the decades. And they also had buzzers underneath the seat, so whenever like a scary scene would come on, they would press the buzzer and it would scare the person. They also paid people in the movie theater to scream, and they would turn off the lights and everybody would get scared. So it also spilled over into the 60s. So it was just a way to, get everyone into the movie theater and make everything like lighthearted, because everyone was still worried about like the nuclear radiation. Also want to mention, whenever you talk about monster movies, you always hear them also called Hammer films, and that's because you had the Hammer Horror Company movie studio. It was founded in 1934, but only started to turn prolific during the 50s. And when it did, it was it was near global dominance. So that's what I wanted to mention about the movie monsters. Some other movies in this era: Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which again, it was like a mutation of some type of plants, and then the people took over the people and it made them to like zombies. You also had like the Curse of Frankenstein that were, spilling over from the 40s, but like I said, around this time the monster movies were pretty much like dead and dying, and no one really wanted to see the older ones. That's why you got now the mutant mega monster genre that took over. Now we get into the era of the 60s, which started the social revolution, what had to do with the racial tensions and the mood in the country, and that reflected its movies. They became darker, more serious, and they had like social commentaries inside the movies having to do with the mood of the country and the racial tension. So, for example, Night of the Living Dead, you had the lead being, a black lead. You also had, I pointed out, a movie from 1964 called 2000 Maniacs, which I never saw, but I looked it up, and it had to do with the tensions in the South. You had Rosemary's Baby towards the end, which was having to do with, demons and demonic occults. So, like I said, the films got more serious, more dark. I also want to point out Alfred Hitchcock started making his movies. People started taking notice of The Psycho, which was a slasher film. You had The Birds, and he made other, horror movies during this time. But I also want to point out 1960s Peeping Tom, which really has nothing to do with the era, but I wanted to point out that it had the first point of view camera shot in there. So first point of view shot. So it technically was the first slasher movie, if you really want to think about it. And then eventually throughout the eras when you started making horror movies and they started using point of view shots, which is very critical to a slasher film, it kind of originated from this movie Peeping Tom, so definitely check it out. So this was the era in the 60s and the different movies based off of the tensions in the mood of the country in that era. Now we get into the 70s era, and the horror movies genre was basically exploitation films. Everything that spilled over from the 60s having to do with violence and the racial tensions just got amplified in the 70s. So you had darker, grittier, grimier films with more violence and just torture, really. So some examples of the films: you had 1972's Blackula, which is a black exploitation film or blaxploitation. You had Texas Chainsaw Massacre. You also had The Hills Have Eyes, and I Spit on Your Grave, which was truly an exploitation film of women. So some other movies I have to mention in there is The Exorcist, which is one of my favorite horror movies of all time, and that really took over that era with the demonic and possession films like that. You also had Halloween, which really focused on slasher films, but they didn't really take off yet. You had The Omen, that came after The Exorcist, and then Amityville Horror, which again had to do with like a haunted house and demons. Phantasm, which was like a mix of demon, demonic, and exploitation, stuff like that. Some other films I threw in there that really don't have to do with the exploitation, but they did have an impact in the era was Jaws, of course, and Alien. So this genre or this era was really dark and grimy, and I'll give you some examples of non-horror films that you could compare it to. So if you ever saw Death Wish with Charles Bronson, or Taxi Driver with Robert De Niro, if you remember the type of shots in those films that were very, had like weirdo people and grimy and, kind of like that if you want to compare it to. I also wanted to put that movie, The Maniac with Joe Spinell, but it came out in the 80s and 1980s, so it didn't quite make the 70s. But if you watch that movie, it's exactly an exploitation film with the feel of that griminess of the streets and the people. So definitely check out that film. And now we get to my favorite era in horror movies, the 80s, with the slasher films. So after the 70s, everything, the Cold War, I guess, was won. Everything was more, the mood of the country was happier, more lighthearted and fun. So the 80s, you had the music and the crazy clothes, colorful clothes. So everything was fun again. So the majority of the movies in the 80s were slasher films. Not all, but 90 to 95%, somewhere in that range, were slasher films. And also Halloween, which, the first movie came out in the 70s, and then they were doing the sequels to that all through the 80s. So that kind of started it off, really. So some movies in 1980, The Shining, which was like a, psychological ghost slasher. You could count it like that. You also had the classic slasher villains. So you had Friday the 13th with Jason, Nightmare on Elm Street with Freddy, Child's Play with Chucky. You had My Bloody Valentine, Poltergeist, Pet Sematary, Fright Night, The Evil Dead, and not to mention all the sequels that those movies spawned, and all the rip-off movies that they spawned. For example, clear rip-off of Friday the 13th, you had Sleepaway Camp or The Burning. So those are some examples of that. Some other movies that were in there that were not actual slashers, but again, I put them in there to let you know they had some impact in the era and to prove that not all of them were slashers. You had Aliens and The Predator. I guess Pet Sematary, that's technically not a slasher. So the mood of the country was lighter, more fun. But then you were starting to get the same problem towards the end of the 80s, leading into the 90s, where there was so many slasher movies that they were running out of ideas, and everything was getting saturated. So you see the pattern that is starting to develop, and I want you to remember that everything happens in cycles, so keep that in mind as we continue. And now we get to the horror movie era of the 90s. So by now, the slasher genre was dead, and everyone was sick and tired of it, and it got turned into a joke, and it was more of a parody. So what happened in the early 90s, you had CGI emerged. If you want to be super technical, in 1989, James Cameron made The Abyss, and if you remember in there, it had that like liquid sea creature eel thing that like turned into a, had a face and it moved around. So then when it came to 1991, James Cameron made Terminator 2, which he had better technology based off of The Abyss. So when he made the T-1000, it was a little bit better technology. But then what happened, which really everything just exploded with CGI, was Jurassic Park, with Industrial Lights and Magic. So once that came out, it was such a big success, and everybody was like, "Wow, this new CGI! It's amazing looking. I'm sure we can use that in our movies." And then non-horror movies started using it, but also horror movies now, instead of using practical effects, we're trying to use CGI. Some of them, because they were early on CGI, most of them looked real bad, but some came out pretty good. So here are some examples of the movies in the early 90s. So you had Ghost, which had some early CGI. It was like a thriller love story. You had Silence of the Lambs, which really it had no CGI, but I just put that in there because it was a movie that was notable in the early 90s. It was like a psychological thriller. Like I said, Terminator, what it started using the early technology, and then Jurassic Park came out. And then towards like the end of the 90s, you started getting a lot of CGI in horror movies like Species, Mimic, The Relic, Event Horizon, even Alien Resurrection, with the sequel, taking advantage of the CGI. And I think the aliens in the Alien Resurrection didn't look that good in some parts. So I remember some of these movies like Anaconda, The Relic, Mimic, Species. I would rent them on VHS when Blockbuster was still around and still alive. But now they're all gone. But I remember the CGI that they used, and at first I was like, wow, that's really cool. But looking back now, they did not hold up, and they looked really, really bad. But actually, Anaconda still holds up. I like the CGI in that. So this was towards the early 90s. Now we're going to get into the mid 90s. So I had to break up the 90s into two parts, and I'll tell you why. Because the early part had to do with CGI, but then what nobody was expecting to happen, you could call it an anomaly, a fluke, but in the middle of the 90s, there was a renaissance of a certain type of genre that no one saw coming. So in 1996, Scream happened. Now, if you want to be super technical about it, in 1994, Wes Craven, a horror movie director, he came out with his sequel, which is really a reimagining or a reboot of Nightmare on Elm Street, which is called The New Nightmare. So people, kind of liked that. So in 1996, he came out with Scream, which actually focused on the slasher movie genre. And in the movie, it actually pointed out the different rules that you had to have in slasher movies. And it was really popular. And it was like a small renaissance, a resurgence, a rebirth, you could call it, of slasher movie genre. So again, people started cashing in, mixed with CGI, stuff like that. You could do like more gory effects. So then you had, it was kind of short, like 5, maybe 6 years of slasher movies. So you had like, Scream and its sequels. You had Urban Legend. You had Halloween H2O, which was a sequel or a reboot. I don't know what you want to call it. Then you had, I Know What You Did Last Summer, which was, a clear slasher movie genre movie like that. Some other movies that were going on at that time, but were not slashers, but they're still horror movies. You had From Dusk Till Dawn and Blade, which both have to do with vampires. Then you also had The Mummy, which used a lot of CGI. They took advantage of that. Now, another interesting thing that happened, also want to mention The Sixth Sense, which was a psychological thriller. So the thing I want to mention, what happened towards the end of the 90s, 1999, you had the Blair Witch Project, which was a new concept of shaky cam. And it was very low budget, but it helped with the effect, and it was very popular. But you didn't have that full explosion of shaky cam movies yet. That comes later in my part 2 video. But it got people, wondering, and it whet their palate. It whet the audience the audience's palate. They were like, this is very interesting. And you had the sequels to that came later, but it got people interested. So the mid-90s had the renaissance of slasher movies, but then it died out once it got to the 2000s. So this is the end of the horror movie era part 1. Make sure to check out part 2 and 3 that are going to be coming out soon. So please like, subscribe, comment down below. Let me know if what I said about the horror movie genre kind of makes sense. And make sure to follow me on Facebook and Twitter. Please subscribe, hit the notification, so when part 2 and 3 come out, you'll know to see them right away. Thank you for listening. Until next time.